Hey there, in this video I am going to show you a couple of tricks that are going to provide you with a workaround for an issue that you might have encountered with the Sonicware Texture Lab. So something I suspect throws a lot of people for a loop with the Texture Lab, no pun intended, is the fact that when you hold down a key and play a sample, the sample automatically loops, and that becomes even more evident if you take your sample and you trim it down. So now, for example, I've isolated that sound, and it just keeps looping on and on. Okay, so what can we do about that? Well, there's two things that I'm going to show you here. The first is to lean into the effect and just turn it into something that sounds intentional and more musical. And then the second trick I'm going to show you is how to actually avoid that looping altogether. Now, you could avoid the issue altogether by taking our granular blend and moving it all the way up. That's going to make us sound like this. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the sample looping, but there are some things we can do with the knobs to take that looping sound and kind of blur it together into something that sounds like just a continuous tone. Like this, for example. Now, I've already done a whole nother video on this. I'll put a link to it above, so I won't go into what I just did there. And what I want to show you in this video is what you can do to avoid having to do that. Because the downside of what I just did is that we are losing our dry sound. This is 100% our wet granular sound. And if I turn the blend back, we can still hear that looping re-emerging. So what can we do about that looping? Let me start with the first trick because it's going to make the second one make more sense. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll back the end point of our sample a bit so that we have a little bit more silence after the sound plays. So we're at about 50. Let's hear what that sounds like. If you get just enough silence after your sound, if you get the timing of this down right, and then also play around with your release a little bit, so let's lower it a little bit from the maximum point, you can start to get what sounds almost like just a delay or echo effect. And you really just have to play around with the release and the length values here. The shorter the length, the more rapid the delay or echo is going to be, whereas the longer the length, the longer the delay. And then release in turn will control how long the pseudo delay or echo goes on for. A shorter release will mean that it will go on for less time. And that's a little bit too short. Let's try this. Yeah, you really have to play this by ear, and the exact values are going to change from sample to sample, and will also depend on what you want to do with it. Okay, now if we want to take this one step further, something that we can do is start playing around with the modulators. So, for example, I'm going to start with modulating the pitch, and I'm going to set the rate to something sort of in the middle here. Probably come back and change that, but the one I really want to focus on here is the depth. So I am going to increase the depth value to 64, and then remember that by default our modulator shape is a sine wave. Now with the shape set to sine wave, this is going to sound pretty terrible. It's going to sound like this. Let's try turning the reverb down on this so you can really hear it. I mean, that could be cool for some sort of like sci-fi video game, but it's not very musical. However, check this out. So instead of the default sine wave, let's change our shape to step plus. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to modulate our starting tone to the value that we set on the depth knob, and it's going to take a giant step from its initial spot to that value set by the depth in a single step, which in this case, 64 happens to be an entire octave above our initial pitch. And that is going to sound like this. Okay, now to take this even further, what we can do is first we can turn on the re-trigger option here. So by default, this is set to off. If I go function re-trigger, we can turn it on. And what that's going to do is it's going to re-trigger the modulation every single time we press the keys, like this. Okay, now let's come back to our rate knob. Our rate knob in this case is controlling how quickly that step up occurs. So if we turn it down, it happens more slowly. Let's turn our release back up so that the note keeps repeating. Whereas if we turn it up, it's going to happen more quickly. In this case, it's happening so quickly that we can barely hear the initial tone. So once again, we just have to play this by ear and find a value that sounds nice. In combination with our length knob, which is controlling how rapidly the repeats are happening. Let's try turning the release back here a bit. Another thing that we can do here is we can turn on the fade in option, which by default is set to off. And this has numerical values of between 1 and 127, just like everything else. And this controls how long it takes for the modulation to transition from the beginning to the end point. And what it's basically going to do is it's going to create a kind of pitch glide effect. So at this point, what we've basically created is kind of a pseudo delay or echo with a pitch glide effect built into it. And if we don't have the glide on, then we basically have a pitch delay. And by the way, we don't have to just go up an octave. We can also go down an octave by going to step minus. And once again, we can fade that in. And so far I've had the blend completely on the dry side of our sound, but we can bring back the granular side and blend the two together. And we also don't have to just go in octaves up or down. For example, we can also do fifths. For that, we want a depth value of 37. By the way, I don't have these values memorized. I have them written down, and I will put them in the video description for easy reference. But anyway, a fifth would sound like this. And once again, we can also go up a fifth. We can take out the fade if we want, bring back in some reverb to make it sound nicer. One thing to keep in mind when bending a pitch up a fifth is that most of your notes are going to sound nice, except for the 7th degree of the scale that you're in. There are music theory reasons for that, but I won't go into it here. Another thing we can do is we can go up or down by fourths, and the value for that would be 26. Most of the notes in the key that you're playing in are going to sound nice as well, except for one, once again, which in this case, and somewhat paradoxically, is the 4th note of the scale that you're in. So if we're in C, the 4th note would be this guy here, and that's going to sound a little bit off key in relation to the other notes. So far so good, and now I play 4th, and it just sounds a little bit weird. And you can also go down a 4th by doing step minus. Now, if we are modulating pitch, then the pitch of the granular side of our blend is also going to be pitched up or down. Actually, let me turn the volume up on this. And maybe we don't want that to happen. Maybe we only want the pitch to be modulated on the dry side of our blend. And in that case, what we can do is to modulate the speed of the sample playback instead of the pitch. Now for these, the depth values are going to be a little bit different. If you want to go an octave up, then you want to go to 42. And let's change this back to step plus. And so now here on the dry side of our blend, we're once again pitching up an octave, but over on the granular side of our blend, our pitch is unaffected. And so now we can blend those two things together if we want. And if we want to pitch an octave down, then we need to change the depth value of our modulation to 95, change our shape back to step minus, and now over on the dry side, we sound like this. Whereas on the granular side, we are still unaffected. So now we can blend those two together. This might also be a good place to play around with your attack. Right now I have my attack at 0, but if we want those notes to be a little less sudden at the beginning, we can turn that up. And then once again, we can also do fifths or fourths. So for example, a fifth up would be 21. Change our shape back to step plus. And actually, I'm going to turn the attack back down a bit. And let's bring back in some of that fade. And let's try playing around with our rate value again. And maybe let's try increasing our length here so we have more of a gap between the repeats. And maybe let's delay the onset of the pitch shift by decreasing our rate value. And give it more time to come in by increasing our release. Maybe a little bit less time before the pitch shift happens. Maybe a little bit less. Anyways, you get the idea. I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm just trying to show that you really do need to play around with these values a bit. And they're very interactive with each other. This length value, the rate value, and the release value, they all play off of each other in creating the sound that you get out of this. And also, as hopefully you could hear with some of those things I was playing, you can get some kind of cool cascading effects going on if you play notes as basically arpeggios. And if you don't want to do that manually, well, you can just turn arpeggio mode on and have the Texture Lab do it for you. Turning down the BPM here. Now we have even more interactivity going on between our tempo knob, length knob, release knob, and rate knob. So yet another ball to juggle. And if we want to make the effect a bit more subtle, what we can do is lean more on the granular side of our blend so that we're just hearing that arpeggiation and pitch shifting in the background. Increase the reverb here. right, I'm almost done with this first trick, but I just want to show you a couple of other options you have here. One is that instead of step plus or step minus, you could change the shape of the modulation to square. So whereas step plus and step minus are going to jump up to a certain value and then stay there, square is going to go back and forth. And then this one works a lot better on pitch rather than speed for the modulation. You can get kind of a cool effect if we hold down Shift and modulate one of our modulator knobs here, our rate knob. That'll sound like this. And something we can do to automate that is to turn on our sequencer and turn on parameter recording. And now I'm basically modulating my modulator on the sequencer. And I can use my BPM knob to basically control the rate of the modulation of my modulation. And maybe let's go more on the granular side here. Or we could do something totally different than pitch modulation. For example, we could modulate our filter. Let's put on a low pass filter. Let's try that for starters. And if we wanted to, we could modulate our modulation on the sequencer. And I can add other kinds of modulation to the sequencer as well. For example, we could try modulating the depth of our modulation. And we could even start adding other things in, like, I don't know, we could try bringing in and out some reverb. Lots of possibilities here. Okay, so that does it for the first trick. And the second trick, it's basically just an extension of the ideas we've just been looking at and just applying them in a different direction. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to clear out the entire pattern so all the settings are reverted to their default values. Now we're back to our original sample. Okay, and now I'm going to once again shorten our sample. Now we're back to that looping. And now we're going to look at how can we actually just avoid that looping altogether instead of leaning into it. And the way we can do that is by selecting the length/feedback option for our modulator and then set our shape to step minus, turn retrigger on, depth all the way up, and then the rate, let's start somewhere in the middle here. And now I'm going to take the blend and I'm going to put it all the way on the dry side so we can hear that. And let me turn the reverb and shimmer off here. And I'm going to increase the release. And now if we play a note, it's going to sound like this. It rings out for a little bit, and then it gets cut off. And we can adjust the time at which that cutoff happens by adjusting the rate knob on our modulation. So if we increase the value, it'll be cut off more quickly, and if we go down, it'll be cut off more slowly. And if we get it just right, we will get the entirety of the sound, but we won't have any looping. Something like that. Now remember, that's on the dry side of our blend. If we go back over to the granular side, we're still going to have the looping going on, but we can do our magic with the knobs to blend that looping together into a sustained note. And so now we can blend the two things together. We can have a little bit of the original sample playing just once, and then we can have a drawn out version of it played on the granular side simultaneously. And since the sound on the dry side is so much louder, what I'm going to do here is turn up our blend so that we lean more on the granular side. Anyway, there you go. That's how you can avoid that looping from happening on the dry side of the blend. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that as you go up in pitch, for example, up here, you are going to start to get a little bit of looping because as you go up in pitch, the sound is going to be played at a faster rate. And so what worked down here isn't going to work up here. So if you do want to play the keyboard up here, you're going to have to make adjustments on the rate knob. But as long as you stay below that point where the looping happens, you'll be good to go. And once again, it might be a good idea here to play around with things like your attack. And things like reverb and shimmer and all of that good stuff. Thing I want to note here is that this works great with samples like the one that we had initially. Let's go back to that. Where you just have a single note that's been sampled, but you can also use this with melodic samples. For example, this ukulele sample that I've used before. So here, let's shorten down our sample. Now here's a place where we really don't want that looping because it sounds like kind of a jackhammer. So let's just do our modulation trick again. Go to line feedback, choose step minus as our shape, put on retrigger, increase our depth to the maximum value, put our rate somewhere in between. We'll probably want to come back to adjust that. And let's go over to the dry side of our blend. Turn the reverb off. And now let's bring back our granular. And let's do some magic to blend it together. I want you to listen closely to what this sounds like. It's not going to sound great. Notice how we're getting some sounds that are different than the one that we've tried to isolate. That's because we've shortened the sample with this knob here. And on the granular side of the blend, what's happening is that when we go higher up on the keyboard, we're going outside of that shortened window that we've created for the sample using the knobs, and we're getting some other notes that are in that sample. So to prevent that from happening, instead of shortening our sample this way with our length knob, what we can do is go function and then this button here, and then bring this value down by holding shift and then turning the value knob. And now we shouldn't have that problem. And here, if we wanted to, something we could do is take our speed knob and go down to, for example, -47, as I've shown in many other videos. And what that's going to do is on the dry side of our blend, we're going to be down an octave. And on the granular side, we're still going to be at the original octave. And so now we can blend those two octaves together. Or we could go up an octave, which would be 21 on the speed knob. Just noticed that through the course of this video, my band-aid has become progressively more disgusting, so I apologize for that. And now my band-aid is gone because I am filming this on another day. As I was editing the video, I realized that I forgot to mention a couple of things. The first one was how the second trick actually works in the first place. So let me just explain that real quick. Okay, so I'm back to our original sample with just the default values on. And I'm going to turn the blend all the way to the dry side, so we just hear that. And let's turn reverb off as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the length knob, and while I'm playing a note, I'm going to make the length value progressively shorter and shorter until we get to the minimum value of 0. And listen to what happens as I do that. So basically, when we start to get into the single digits, the sample becomes so short that on the dry side, we get what sounds like just a basic sound wave. And as that value gets more extreme, so does that effect. And then if we go to 1 or 0, it gets so short that basically the Texture Lab just kind of gives up and we end up with silence. Okay, so now if we roll back our length a bit here, when we do our modulation trick, which is modulating the length parameter, and doing so with a step minus shape with retriggering on, and we put the depth all the way up and the rate in the middle, what's basically happening is that after the amount of time specified by the rate has elapsed, we are using our depth, which we've driven to the maximum value, and using our shape, which is going down, to push that length value to its minimal possible value, which is 0, and is the point at which the sample turns into silence. And so that's how our effect works. If we didn't set this completely at maximum, then we'd start getting those basic sound wave sounds again. In this case, I had to set the depth to a pretty low value because I'd already shortened the length over here, but if I put that back up to the top, then I would have to take our depth and move that pretty far up to get those sound wave sounds. Okay, so let's make that silent again. And now let's move over to the granular side of our blend, where remember, we are continuing to get that looping. And as I've mentioned, there are ways that we can blur that looping into a continuous tone, but the thing that I forgot to mention is what if you want to avoid the looping altogether on the granular side as well as the dry side of the blend? Well, for this one, what we can do is we can use another modulator to modulate the position of our sample playback. And this time for our shape, we are going to select step plus, and let's put on retriggering, and I'm going to set the rate of the second modulator somewhere in the middle. And then for the depth, well, for this, you're really going to have to play things by ear, and it's really going to change from sample to sample. But what we're basically wanting to do is this. So imagine this is our entire sample, the 6 seconds of recording, and imagine our sound occupies just this portion of that overall sample. And so from here to here, we just have silence. What we basically want to do with the second modulator is after the amount of time specified by our rate parameter on the second modulator, we want the position of the playback to jump from the beginning, or wherever we want it to start, to somewhere in that silent stretch, so that after a second or two, or whatever we've specified, the sound gets cut off and stops looping. So let's try doing that. I'm going to put shift function on so I can do this with just one hand and play the keys simultaneously. Something like that. Now in this sample that I'm using, we have that initial sound, and then the bit after this, it's not really technically silence because you can still hear some background noise. And so when we do this trick with this particular sample, we're not going to get true silence. But if you did have a stretch of silence after your sound within that 6-second window, then you would end up getting silence by doing this trick. And now if we want to, we can go back to blending these two things together, and let's see what that sounds like. And there you have it. All right, so remember, I'm going to put a list of those various parameter values in the video description below, so check those out. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day. Hope to see you again soon, and goodbye for now.